It is the 18th of February, 1944, and over the flat, frozen fields of northern France, 18 aircraft are flying so low that farmers below can see the pilots' faces. They skim hedgerows at over 400 kilometers an hour, engines snarling, wingtips almost brushing the poplar trees that line the road to Amiens. Inside the prison ahead, more than 700 people wait in cells, many of them members of the French resistance, scheduled for execution within days. The aircraft carry no machine guns blazing, no fighter escort circling protectively above. What they carry is precision and an almost unbelievable secret. Every single one of them is built largely from wood. Within minutes, bombs strike the prison's outer walls with such accuracy that sections collapse like a stage set, while the cell blocks beyond remain largely intact. Prisoners stumble through the breach into the winter air, some still in their nightclothes, running towards the tree line as the aircraft bank away and vanish as quickly as they arrived. This is Operation Jericho, and the aircraft making it possible is the Havilland Mosquito, a bomber that should not, by any conventional military logic, have worked at all. Britain in late 1944 had spent 5 years building an air force out of aluminium, rivets and desperation. And yet, here was a machine built largely by furniture makers, piano manufacturers and coach builders, using techniques closer to cabinet making than aircraft engineering, regularly outrunning the very fighters sent to intercept it. This was not a stopgap or a curiosity. It was, by several measures, the most versatile combat aircraft of the Second World War, and it began life as an idea that the Air Ministry initially refused to fund. To understand why a wooden bomber became one of Britain's most formidable weapons, you first have to understand the crisis that made it necessary, and a designer stubborn enough to ignore the men in Whitehall who told him it could not be done. What follows is the story of how a private aviation company, working largely without official backing, built an aircraft so fast it didn't need to defend itself, and so unconventional that German intelligence struggled for years to understand how Britain was building it at all. By the autumn of 1938, with war looking close to inevitable, the Royal Air Force faced a problem that aluminium alone could not solve. Britain's aircraft industry depended on light alloys, and light alloys depended on bauxite, much of which had to be shipped in from overseas under conditions that would only worsen once the Atlantic became a battlefield. Every Spitfire, every Hurricane, every heavy bomber competed for the same finite pool of duralumin, and the Air Ministry's planners knew that demand would soon outstrip supply by a considerable margin. Some estimates from the period suggested that aluminium shortages could limit aircraft production by as much as a fifth within the first 18 months of sustained conflict, a gap that could mean the difference between air superiority and disaster. This was not an abstract worry confined to planning documents. Convoys bringing bauxite and finished aluminium ingots across the Atlantic were already prime targets for German U-boats, and every ship lost to torpedo attack represented airframes that would never be built. Factories converting ore into usable sheet metal were themselves limited in number and vulnerable to bombing, creating a bottleneck that no amount of wartime urgency could simply wish away. The Air Ministry's planners understood that whichever side could keep building aircraft when the other could not would hold a decisive long-term advantage, and Britain's position in that calculation looked increasingly precarious. At the same time, existing bomber doctrine was proving badly outdated. The conventional wisdom of the 1930s held that a heavily armed bomber, bristling with defensive machine guns, could fight its way through enemy fighter screens largely unescorted. Early war experience demolished that theory with brutal speed. Slow, heavily laden bombers, like the Bristol Blenheim, suffered catastrophic losses on daylight raids, their gun turrets no match for fast, cannon-armed German fighters. The bombers that survived did so largely by switching to night operations, sacrificing accuracy for survival, a trade that left Bomber Command struggling to hit anything smaller than an entire city district. Crews who flew those early missions described the experience in stark terms. Long, lumbering approaches towards heavily defended targets, turret gunners attempting to track fighters moving twice as fast as their own aircraft, and the grim mathematics of loss rates that made some squadrons reluctant to count how many crews had failed to return from a given week's operations. Losses on some daylight raids in 1940 and 1941 ran high enough that commanders quietly abandoned tactics within months of adopting them, searching for any alternative that did not amount to simply accepting attrition as the cost of doing business. What the RAF needed was something that broke the equation entirely. A bomber fast enough that it simply did not need heavy defensive armament, did not need a large crew to operate that armament, and therefore did not need to compete so heavily for scarce strategic materials. On paper, this sounded close to impossible. Speed of that magnitude generally meant a small, lightweight airframe, yet bombers needed to carry meaningful payloads over meaningful distances. Every serving aircraft designer in Britain understood the trade-off between speed, payload, and range as something close to immovable physics, and most assumed that an unarmed bomber flying into contested airspace was simply asking to be shot down. Geoffrey de Havilland did not agree, and his company had spent years quietly experimenting with an unfashionable material that the rest of the industry had largely abandoned: wood. The de Havilland Aircraft Company, based at Hatfield in Hertfordshire, had built its reputation partly on elegant wooden-framed aircraft like the Comet Racer, which had already demonstrated impressive speed and range using timber construction in long-distance air races during the 1930s. De Havilland's engineers believed that modern construction techniques, refined adhesives, and careful aerodynamic shaping could push that older tradition of timber aircraft, building far further than anyone within the Air Ministry had seriously considered for a frontline combat type. When de Havilland's team first proposed an unarmed, twin-engined wooden bomber, relying purely on speed for survival, the response from officials was, for some time, polite skepticism bordering on outright dismissal. The idea of sending a bomber over enemy territory without a single defensive machine gun struck many in the Air Ministry as reckless to the point of irresponsibility, regardless of how fast the aircraft might prove to be on paper. It took considerable persistence, a working relationship with sympathetic figures inside the ministry, and ultimately a private venture funded largely by de Havilland itself before official orders finally followed, and even then only cautiously, with many senior figures expecting the project to fail. The technical answer that emerged from Hatfield, refined through 1939 and 1940, was a fuselage built using molded plywood sandwich construction, a method borrowed loosely from boat building, but pushed to far greater extremes. Two thin layers of birch plywood were bonded around a core of lightweight balsa wood, creating a shell that was both remarkably strong and remarkably light, roughly comparable in principle to corrugated cardboard, except formed into smooth, load-bearing curves rather than flat sheets. This sandwich was cured inside concrete molds shaped like halves of the fuselage. Then the two halves were joined down the center line, with bulkheads and control runs fitted before the skin was ever closed up around them. The wings used spruce spar construction with plywood skinning, again drawing on established furniture and boat-building techniques, rather than anything resembling conventional aircraft metalwork. Crucially, the adhesive holding all of this together was a relatively new synthetic resin glue, formaldehyde-based and remarkably durable, which meant joints could be trusted to survive the stresses of high-speed flight and rapid maneuvering without the rivets or welds that metal aircraft depended upon. Power came from two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engine family, fitted to the Spitfire, mounted in nacelles slung beneath the wings, stripped of almost all defensive weaponry, and built from a material roughly a third the density of aluminium for equivalent strength. The resulting aircraft weighed dramatically less than conventional bombers of similar size. The prototype first flew on November 25, 1940, from Hatfield Aerodrome, and almost immediately demonstrated something extraordinary: a top speed exceeding 630 kilometers an hour, faster than the Spitfire fighters meant to protect conventional bombers, and faster than almost anything the Luftwaffe could put into the air at altitude. Production spread far beyond de Havilland's own factories, because the work demanded skilled woodworking rather than heavy metal fabrication. Furniture manufacturers, piano makers, and even coach-building firms across Britain were brought into the supply chain, their craftsmen retrained to produce aircraft components to aviation tolerances rather than dining tables and chairs. Firms that had spent decades building cabinets, pianos, and shop fittings suddenly found themselves manufacturing fuselage shells and wing spars to drawings supplied from Hatfield. Their existing skill with fine joinery and precise gluing, translating with surprising ease onto aircraft components. Many of these workshops employed large numbers of women, whose existing experience with detailed handwork and finishing translated directly onto the production line, at a time when the wider aircraft industry was also drawing heavily on female labor to replace men called up for military service. This distributed approach carried a further strategic advantage that the Air Ministry came to appreciate only gradually. Spreading production across dozens of smaller furniture workshops, rather than concentrating it within a handful of large aircraft factories, made the supply chain considerably harder for German bombers to disrupt through targeted raids. A single successful strike against a major aluminium aircraft plant could halt production of an entire type for months, knocking out one furniture workshop in the Mosquito's sprawling network barely dented overall output. By the time production ended, roughly 7,781 Mosquitoes had been built across Britain, Canada, and Australia. An extraordinary figure for an aircraft the Air Ministry had nearly refused to commission at all, and an output figure that some historians treat as approximate given incomplete surviving wartime production ledgers. The Mosquito's combat record reads almost like a list of impossible missions made routine. Beyond Amiens, crews flew the audacious low-level raid on the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo in September 1942, slipping in beneath enemy radar to strike a target conventional bombers could never have approached without devastating losses. Pilots on these low-level raids often described flying so close to the ground that they had to climb briefly to clear telegraph wires and church spires, navigating largely by landmark recognition at speeds that left little room for hesitation or error. In Copenhagen in March 1945, mosquitoes struck the Shellhus building, housing the Gestapo's local headquarters, again at rooftop height, in an operation aimed at disrupting the organization believed to be holding Danish resistance prisoners inside. Records from these raids remain incomplete in places, with some outcomes and casualty figures still debated by historians. But the operational pattern is consistent. Precision strikes against targets too small, too well defended, or too politically sensitive for area bombing. Beyond these headline raids, mosquitoes served as fast reconnaissance aircraft, photographing enemy positions deep inside occupied Europe, as night fighters hunting German bombers over British cities, and as pathfinder aircraft marking targets for the heavy bomber streams that followed behind them. Reconnaissance crews flying unarmed mosquitoes over enemy territory relied entirely on speed and altitude to avoid interception, a tactic that proved remarkably effective precisely because so few enemy fighters could close the distance quickly enough to engage before the mosquito had already passed beyond range. German fighter pilots reported the unsettling experience of sighting a mosquito, attempting an interception, and watching it simply pull away, its speed advantage often too great to overcome even with a height and position advantage at the start of the chase. Some Luftwaffe pilots later described the sensation as closer to chasing a shadow than engaging an enemy aircraft, a frustration that filtered upward through German command structures as reports accumulated of intercepts attempted and abandoned. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Germany never produced a true equivalent, despite trying. The Luftwaffe's closest answer, the Arado R-234, did not enter service until 1944 and relied on early jet engines rather than wood, suffering chronic reliability problems and arriving in numbers too small to matter strategically, with total production figures only reaching into the low hundreds compared with the Mosquito's thousands. German engineers experimented with their own composite and mixed construction designs at various points in the war, but none combined the Mosquito's speed, range, and adaptability across so many different combat roles, and none reached anything close to comparable production numbers. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring is recorded as having complained bitterly to aircraft manufacturers that British furniture makers could outproduce his own metal-based industry, a remark that, whether or not delivered in exactly those words, captures the genuine alarm the Mosquito caused within the German High Command. That such frustration came from the man responsible for the entire Luftwaffe says a good deal about how seriously German air planners took the threat posed by an aircraft many of them had initially dismissed as a wooden novelty. American alternatives followed a fundamentally different philosophy. Aircraft like the North American B-25 Mitchell and Martin B-26 Marauder were conventional metal bombers, well-armed, well-armored, and reliant on defensive firepower and formation tactics rather than outright speed. Cruising speeds for these American medium bombers typically sat well below 450 kilometers an hour, leaving them dependent on fighter escort and tight formation, flying to survive contact with enemy interceptors. They served their purpose effectively, but neither could approach the Mosquito's combination of pace and altitude performance, and neither offered the same flexibility across reconnaissance, night fighting, and precision strike roles within a single airframe. The Mosquito's nearest genuine rival in concept, the unarmed fast bomber, simply did not exist elsewhere in significant numbers during the war, leaving Britain with several years of effective monopoly on the idea. American observers were sufficiently impressed that some Mosquitoes were supplied to United States forces for evaluation and limited operational use, while the basic principle that speed alone could serve as a credible substitute for armor and guns would echo through aircraft design for a generation afterwards. Assessing the Mosquito's overall impact means separating measurable results from psychological effect and acknowledging that the two were deeply intertwined. Materially, the aircraft's reconnaissance variants supplied crucial intelligence ahead of major operations, while its night fighter variants accounted for a substantial share of German bombers and V-1 flying bombs destroyed over Britain in the war's later stages, though precise kill figures remain debated among historians working from incomplete wartime records. Psychologically, the effect on German air defense planning was significant and well documented. An aircraft that couldn't reliably be intercepted forced the diversion of fighter resources and radar attention that might otherwise have concentrated against heavier bomber formations. The Mosquito's influence extended well beyond 1945. Its demonstration that speed and altitude could substitute for defensive armament fed directly into post-war thinking about fast jet bombers designed to outrun interception entirely, an idea later realized more fully in aircraft like the English electric Canberra. Today, complete and airworthy Mosquitoes are rare, partly because wooden airframes are far less likely to survive decades of storage than metal ones. But surviving examples can be seen at the de Havilland Aircraft Museum at London Colney, built around the original Salisbury Hall site where the prototype was developed, as well as in collections including the RAF Museum and several institutions in Canada and New Zealand. Return for a moment to that February morning over Amiens, 18 wooden aircraft skimming the frost-covered fields at a speed no metal bomber of the era could match. It is worth sitting with how strange that image really is. Britain's aircraft industry, faced with a shortage of the very metal that defined modern aviation, did not simply ration what little aluminium remained. It looked sideways towards furniture workshops and piano factories, towards a material every serious engineer of the age considered obsolete, and built from it one of the fastest, most adaptable combat aircraft to fly in the entire war. What the Mosquito achieved was not one breakthrough but several, stacked on top of each other. It solved a material shortage by abandoning the assumption that modern aircraft required modern materials. It solved a tactical problem by abandoning the assumption that bombers needed to fight their way to the target, choosing instead simply to outrun anything sent to stop them. And it solved an industrial problem by drawing skilled labor from outside the traditional aviation sector entirely, putting cabinet makers and instrument craftsmen to work building one of the most effective weapons of the war. None of this happened because the Air Ministry demanded it. It happened largely because Geoffrey de Havilland and his engineers at Hatfield refused to accept that an unconventional answer was automatically a wrong one, and pressed ahead with a private venture that official channels had been reluctant to fund. The aircraft that resulted earned nicknames on both sides of the conflict: that hint at the same underlying disbelief. British crews and the press called it the wooden wonder, while German pilots, watching it slip away time and again beyond the reach of their cannons, had rather less affectionate names for an enemy bomber their fighters simply could not catch. Built from spruce, birch and balsa, glued together by furniture makers, flown by crews who trusted their lives to a fuselage no thicker in places than a kitchen tabletop, the Mosquito should, by every conventional measure of 1940s aviation thinking, have been a failure. Instead, it became one of the most feared and most versatile aircraft of the Second World War. Sometimes, the most advanced solution to an impossible problem is not a new material at all, but the willingness to look again at an old one and ask what it might still be capable of.